So the American War for Independence, or the American Revolution, is one of the most transformative events in the 18th century. And moreover, it is one of the greatest events that takes place in the Western world, and it really ignites the period of revolutions that will ultimately go over, or that will continue on into France and beyond, into the revolutions of 1815, of 1830, and ultimately of 1848. That it really sets off a movement and a drive where a group of colonial people were willing to risk an enormous amount of their livelihoods, their very lives themselves in many cases, in order to pursue this notion of English freedom that they held so strongly. And they believed that they were the ancestors of those people who had fought in 1688 in the Glorious Revolution against tyranny, and that their rights, their legitimate rights of freedom, had been usurped. So I think that this is often overlooked, and what was risked in this war by the people who participated in it. And there have been historiographical efforts. Historians have sought to show that there were ulterior motivations, and I'm sure that unquestionably that there were more than just a single motivation. But I don't believe in one particular school of thought that all of the founders were simply out and motivated by money, or that they were driven by taxation. It takes extremely powerful ideological reasons to fight a war, and to moreover fight a war against an enemy that is vastly greater in strength than that of yourself, and to risk your property, your life, your family, everything in this struggle. So I think that this should not be overlooked in the revolution. So let us begin simply by looking at Britain's empire. And Britain had really acquired an empire during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and they had also not really had any kind of a plan for the acquisition of this empire and what they would do. They don't really develop an imperial constitution. They don't really have any kind of centralized imperial plan. And this is made very clear in Jack Green's great book on the constitutional origins of the American Revolution. But nevertheless, the colonists believed that there was an imperial constitution, that they were as much Englishmen as were those people that lived in England itself, and so therefore they were participating in this great constitutional effort, and this legacy of freedom that they and their ancestors had continued to fight for. So because that they believed that they had no representation, or that they believed that their colonial legislatures, where power had resided, where they were kind of mini parliaments in the North American colonies, there was a strong belief that these legislatures, their power had been usurped by royal governors, and ultimately that they were not being able to consent in their government, which is a fundamental right guaranteed through Magna Carta and a legacy of English liberty. And within the British Empire, this is overlooked. It's if these questions had been addressed by the king and the king's government, they could have averted this struggle with the colonies. But nevertheless, they didn't. And oftentimes, George III is portrayed as kind of a great tyrant. But the king himself had not, or did not desire to kind of usurp the authority of colonists, but simply he saw them as petulant subjects in some way, that they were represented just like all of the other people in the British Empire, and that is through a kind of a theoretical representation. The great cities of Manchester and Birmingham, the second and third largest cities in England, that had zero representatives in Parliament. The Sugar Isles, Barbados, had no representatives in Parliament. So it was just simply a virtual representation that the people who sat in Parliament were going to look after their interest. And George III very much saw this as that he would look after the colony's interests. But the colonists said that because our colonial legislatures had been stripped of their authority, and that the royal governors were attempting to rule arbitrarily, that this was an attack on their freedom, and because they had not been able to consent in taxation, ultimately, that this is what was driving this, and therefore it ultimately led them to rebel against the crown itself. So we can see here the transformation of the English monarchy from that never was an absolute monarchy. The English have never had an absolute monarchy since Magna Carta in 1215. But there was attempts by the Stuart kings to gain absolute authority, to rule as absolute monarchs without Parliament. And there were struggles fought between Parliament and the king. Ultimately, the English Civil War ignites this, and Charles I is executed for attempting to rule arbitrarily and to throw out Parliament. The Glorious Revolution is fought in 1688. And the Declaration of Right is put forward that no king can rule arbitrarily. And Parliament invites, asks, anoints William and Mary to come and be their kings instead of James II, who had abandoned the throne. And ultimately, after this, there is a settlement where Parliament again selects another monarch, George of Hanover, who is George I of England, the grandfather of George III, who is made famous in the American Revolution. But it is Parliament who is participating in this government. The king, along with the authority of the king kind of being in question based upon virtual versus actual representation, as the great theorist Edmund Burke argues, that there is the problem of revenue raising. That this is where kind of I mean, if you really look into the American Revolution, this is where the origins of the conflict begin. And that is in these direct taxes that are placed upon the colonist. And that is the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, and finally the Tea Act. And these are very small taxes, but they are direct taxes. They're not indirect. They're not simply customs duties that had been paid for centuries. These are direct taxation that the colonists have not been asked about. They have not been participated in government. They likely would have passed these kinds of acts in order to gain protections from their great fears, which was the French in the north, and as well as from Indian raids from the Appalachian region. But there had been a massive war debt that had been acquired during the 7 Years' War, and Britain had to do something. And there was a repeal of the Sugar Act. There was repeal of the Townshend duties. There was a repeal of the Stamp Act because of agitation from the colonists. There arose committees of correspondence among the colonists that they wrote back and forth, that they began to try to see a unity in their struggle against this what they believed to be an arbitrary form of government. And in this resistance, they began to coalesce. They began to come together in uniting against their overlords from England. And really, the epicenter of the struggle of those who are most angry is in Boston. This is where the violence begins to center. One evening, of course, in response to this agitation from colonists, and especially in Massachusetts, the British have garrisoned troops there. Then they have, and the troops, of course, do everything in their power in order to agitate the colonists, to kind of provoke them, and they jeer at them in the streets and things like that, and they talk of them as provincial dandies and things like this. And ultimately, one evening, a few colonists come out, and they begin to. They're drunk, of course, and the British soldiers are there to stop a fight. Everyone's out in the street to watch a fight between two drunken men. and the soldiers show up to maintain order. And then someone starts throwing rocks, and they start jeering at the soldiers, and then another rock is hurled, and finally something happens, and a musket goes off, and the entire British line is formed up, and the captain gives an order to fire, and they shoot down a number of these people, and eventually several die in this altercation. This is known as the Boston Massacre. And ultimately, this will come to a head after the Tea Act is passed as well. Right, there's this memory of the British being this sort of arbitrary force in the city of Boston, and then we see the Tea Act being passed, and this is the final straw for many of those members who came to the Green Dragon Inn, and those Sons of Liberty. This is this great group who comes together. People like Sam Adams, John Adams. And they come together, and they began to agitate, and they began to think, instead of just pursuing their legitimate rights as Englishmen, that they would become an American colony, or that they would become an American nation, a new nation founded upon Republican principles, and that they would begin to resist actively against ultimately the British. And therefore, when the Tea Act is passed, right, so there's a small tax that is placed upon tea. And the East India Company, who has very large amounts of surplus tea, needs a break. And the British government has given them a relief package, if you will. And they have just placed a very small tax on the tea, and they have foregone all their export duties in England, and therefore they are going to send this tea to the colonists, and the tea is actually going to be cheaper than any other tea that they could buy. Significantly cheaper, because all the taxes have been waived, or the export duties have been waived, except this one small tea tax on the colonists that they have to pay a very small amount, but it's still vastly cheaper than the Dutch tea or the French tea that they could purchase instead of this. And I think that this goes to show that there was a real resolve here among some people, that they said, well, this is Britain simply trying to undermine us, that they are going to give us cheap tea, and we are going to forget about our loss of liberty. So in result to this, the Sons of Liberty dress up as Mohawk Indians, and they board the British ship that has sailed into Boston Harbor. Several of the British ships that had sailed into Boston Harbor that were owned by the East India Company, and they board these ships, and they began to hurl the tea into the port, or into the water. And this is known as the Boston Tea Party. And when this occurs, this is the absolute final straw for Britain, and they close the port of Boston, and they say it will remain closed until the East India Company has been compensated for the loss of its tea. So this, in many ways, kind of kicks off the American Revolution, if you will, and I will now begin referring to colonists as Americans. And one of the great struggles here, and the shot heard round the world, fired at Lexington and Concord, and this is one of the kind of great stories of the American Revolution, in that General Howe, who had come to replace General Gage as the commander of the British troops in North America, learned of the colonists amassing a weapons store and perhaps even some cannon in the city of Lexington. And therefore he sends a force of approximately 800 British redcoats from Boston to Lexington to acquire these goods. And they are met, and then this is very important, and also that they had found he had report that the great agitators John Adams and Samuel Adams were were there, those Sons of Liberty, and that he was going to try to arrest them. And so they began to march. And Paul Revere, the silversmith, he gets on his horse, and he is a member of this group. He was a member of the Committees of Correspondence and an American patriot. And he gets on his horse and he begins to gallop down the road. And he as legend says, he shouts, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" And he hangs a lantern in. This was a sign that of where the British attack would come. 1 by land and 2 by sea. He would hang a lantern in the Old North Church in Boston. And by that, everyone would know to be able to marshal their troops in the correct places. And this is made famous in the poem, "The Midnight Ride" of Paul Revere. But so Revere does this, and the British began to march through Concord on their way to Lexington. And on that way, because of Revere and others, word had spread throughout the countryside and the towns that indeed the British were marching on Lexington. And so the colonial militiamen, the Minutemen as they were called, began to come out of their homes. They began to pour out of their homes, and they assemble, first at Concord and all along the road. And these were, in many cases, crack troops. These were veterans of the 7 Years' War. They had served dutifully in the colonial militia. And depending on whose reports you read, they were quite good soldiers, from what can be understood. And they also had their long Kentucky or Pennsylvania rifles with them. Some of them did. And they set themselves up along the road where the British will begin to march, and they meet them. The British meet them at Concord, and they ultimately dissipate, and finally they assemble at the Lexington Common. And the British troops come in there, and someone fires a shot. No one knows who fires the first shot, but this is the shot heard round the world, as is often in our textbooks. One particular historian, Jonathan Clark, actually suggests that this might have been a parson, a preacher, a radical preacher who wanted to see the American Revolution come to a head. That he fired a shot up in the air in the bushes near the Lexington Common, and then there begins a volley. The British fire and the Americans fire, and there's quite a struggle. And then the British began to beat a retreat to move back to Boston. They had not ever considered that they would meet this kind of resistance on the road, and all the way back that they are harassed. They are fired upon by those hid in the trees and along the roads, and those few squadrons that had assembled up, and they were fired on again and again and again, and suffering ultimately about 200 casualties on their way back from Concord or from Lexington to Boston. So this ignites ultimately the American Revolution. That at this point, Britain makes a decision that they would have to fight a great military struggle to put down this rebellion. And the colonists ultimately decide that they would have to put forth a Declaration of Independence, that they would say that we are going to not only do away with the Parliament of Great Britain, that we no longer wish to be under the British Crown, but we wish to be an independent republic. And so they send the Declaration of Independence to the King in England. And Thomas Jefferson, who is the secretary of the Continental Congress, and there had been several meetings of the Continental Congress, and at the second meeting of the Continental Congress, they meet at Freedom Hall in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. And they set forth this great document that if you study American history, in 1,000 years from now, you might not read any document, but you would read the Declaration of Independence. And it asserts those rights from Enlightenment thinking, from John Locke, who is the honorary American founding father, that the fundamental rights of an Englishman are life, liberty, and property. But Thomas Jefferson writes that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, and chief among these being the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson here is hearkening back to an ancient form of natural rights theory that was taught by the Stoics all the way back in ancient Greece and Rome, and was carried forward into the Enlightenment, and that these are the same rights. These are natural rights that are absolute through all time and all places. It's what Jefferson is arguing. I am not arguing that these are absolute and fundamental natural rights, but this is what they had in their mind, that if these rights, which were so evident that you could not miss them, they are self-evident, that we are all created equal and that we have these rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That we have a right to live as we choose. We have a right to elect a free government that is free from foreign control, and that ultimately we can live as we choose, so long as we harm no one else. That these were fundamental rights of nature, guaranteed by nature's God, by the divine, by this notion of a deistic God that was powerful and had ordered the universe to some degree. So this is what Jefferson is arguing here. This is what the founding fathers are saying, that these are natural rights, and these come out of our collective struggle against or our collective English heritage and our heritage of being men of the West, and children of the classics. That we can find these rights that go all the way back into the time of the ancients. So this is a very important document, and this is of course, obviously severs the link with Britain for at least some people. Now, there is a belief here that, especially in Hollywood films, that sort of all colonists at this point come over and that they are now patriotic Americans. Now, in reality, there's probably, it used to be a theory, and I have never been able to find where this comes from or what evidence it is to suggest this, but there is a third of people who are patriotic Americans, a third of people who are loyalists, and then a third of the people who are quite indifferent. I have no idea where this axiom comes from. It has been told and told since time immemorial. But I speculate that there is a small group of people who are highly devoted patriots. I suspect that there is maybe 10 to 15% of the population. I suspect there is another very staunchly devoted group of loyalists, such as Samuel Seabury, who wrote famously the letters from a pencil, but that was John Dickinson. But nevertheless, there are very staunch supporters of both sides in small minorities. And then there is a very large group, say 70%, that is in the middle, that just really want to live unmolested or would be quite content, though maybe grumpy to pay taxes, but they just really want to continue carrying on living their lives without the threat of war, invasion, or seizure of their property, or being forced into a conscription in the American army. So, but nevertheless, this group of radical thinkers that we call the American founders, the founding fathers, come together and they put forward this great charter of freedom, this Declaration of Independence. And they will ultimately have the resolve to win out and form a republic. So let us begin to look how the war was fought here. So the British are going to face a nearly impossible task here. This is not any kind of modern war. This is a huge front. 3,000 miles of coastline. Vastly, some of the most rugged territory that had ever been seen. Nothing like Europe. That it was enormously wooded. It was mountainous. If you've ever been to upstate New York and gone through the Adirondack Mountains, I mean, this is some of the densest cover that you have ever seen. This is not an easily conquerable region. and ultimately that it is a rural area. It is not there are not a lot of large cities. The biggest city in the colonies is New York, where only 20 to 30,000 people lived in. So you could conquer every city along the coast, but ultimately you have not taken all the ground or anywhere near it. And it would take a vast army in order to hold this ground, and it would just simply not be worth it economically to be able to have to garrison that many troops. So obviously communication is a big problem. So there will be a supreme commander appointed. That was General Gage originally, and then it became General Howe because of the vast distance between England and America. So it took 120 days or thereabouts in the best of times to get a response. So if you send a letter on what do I do, it's going to be at least 3 months, maybe 4 months before you get a response from London on how they wish you to proceed. There are not great roads. There are not great maps, and ultimately there is kind of a lacking in centralized authority in the colonies. That you have a general, but ultimately all of the governors and the British officials are independent in each colony. They're all sovereign in their own little areas. So there's not sort of a viceroy or something that can bring to bear all the resources of the colonies on the British side. But the Americans, of course, have gone and they have coalesced. That they have called congresses, they have met together, and that they have more. They are more united than are the British. So there are this question of forts. So you began to see a transformation of fortifications during the late Middle Ages. With the advent of gunpowder and the cannon, we began to see here fortresses like this Star fortress here, vast fortifications that have very low walls. The cannons can be placed on them, trenches that are dug, and these are very difficult places to take through simply storming the fort. Because of the advent of gunpowder. But the best way to take a fortification is by, of course, starving them out or convincing someone to open the gates to you. But the key to any fort is, of course, your strategic position. It has to occupy a strategic position, so therefore your enemy cannot go around you, cannot ignore you. It should be good to be up on a height so you can see that your enemy is coming, and ultimately it needs a water source in order to keep you supplied in fresh water in the event of a siege. So how did Americans go about fighting this war? They, of course, had some forts that were controlled by the British, but the Brown Bess is the weapon of the infantry, and this is the main fighting force, and that is the infantry. And these are linear tactics that you would line up in rows of 2 to 3 men deep, and you would then bring to bear. You would drop your muskets down. The first line would fire. Those men would kneel down. The second line would fire. They would kneel down, and all of these, while the time they would begin to reload. And then the next line would fire, and then you would put forward the great weapon of the infantryman. You would put the bayonet on the end, which is a long spear-like object that goes on the end of a musket, and the infantry would then march forward, and that they would use the bayonet against the enemy. But very oftentimes the goal is, of course, just to push the enemy army off the field. And not, it's very rare actually that bayonet combat took place where they were actually killing the enemy with a bayonet. But the key here is to allow your enemy to get as close as you possibly can to them before you fire. So the musket is smooth bore, so that means it is not accurate. It's not rifled at all. So the bullet is not spinning around in a circle. It is tremendously inaccurate weapon. So you can only hit a target of about the size of 10 by 10 up to about 50 or 60 yards. So the key here is to pour as much fire on the enemy as is possible, as close range as possible. The goal is not to be accurate, but simply to fire with as much power and as many muskets as you can upon the enemy. And of course, this causes a vast amount of smoke to happen because these are flintlock weapons, and therefore the battlefields become clouded with smoke, haze, dense fogs on them and you have to continually move, and things are confusing. It's a terribly difficult way to fight, and it requires discipline. Enormous discipline and good training in order to be successful in these tactics. So here are just a few commands that are the hierarchy of the officers here, and you can see how conspicuously the uniforms are in comparison to modern military uniforms, because you are fighting on open field. You want to be able to see who you are fighting. And you need to be seen on the field. Your uniform distinguishes you as an officer, because officers were not targeted. They were not shot. These are the upper echelon of society who are leading these troops, and therefore it's kind of this gentlemanly warfare. And then you can see, of course, here the uniform of an infantryman, who is an enlisted man, if you will. And they wore these bright uniforms because they're fighting and not in secret or anything. They don't wear camouflage, but they fight in open fields, and they agree upon when to fight. It's not secret or armies that sneak up on each other. But something very important about the British system is that they had this thing that is called the purchase system. And army officers were not promoted on the basis of merit. That if you remember back to the time of the English Civil Wars that I spoke about very briefly, when the King Charles I was executed, Oliver Cromwell institutes this thing called the New Model Army, where officers were promoted on merit and not because that they were part of the aristocracy of England. So in response to this, after the end of the time of the Cromwellian dictatorship, and the return of the kings, the Stuart kings of England, the English created this thing called the purchase system. And it was in place for over 200 years, and it was ultimately abolished after the Crimean War, or the devastating effects of this in the Crimean War in the 1850s. But it lasted all the way until 1883, and it was that in order to be an officer in the Army, you were required to purchase your commission. So if you wanted to be a lieutenant, which is the lowest rank, you had to buy your lieutenant's commission for about £1,000. And this is an enormous amount of money. And it's designed in order to keep people who are not part of the aristocracy out of positions of authority, because they never want another Oliver Cromwell to rise up who was not a member of the aristocracy and do something silly like promote people based upon merit instead of their heredity. But this is how the British Army is ultimately is composed of, or at least their officer corps is ultimately composed of. So if you wish to be a colonel or something, that's a very expensive commission, and only the highest level aristocrats can afford to pay these massive amounts of money, which could be as much as £15,000 for a really good command. And of course, you had to pay for all your officer or your men's uniforms as well. These were not something that the crown was going to give you a lot of money to do. That you had to almost out of your own pocket pay for these uniforms if you wanted anything other than the most base uniforms. And this was a great competition among the soldiers to have the best uniforms. And George Washington actually wanted nothing more than to be a British officer. But the only reason he could not be a British officer was because he could not afford the commission. How different the world might have been in the event that he was able to afford his commission. So as I said, the officers in each army were, of course, gentlemen. That they had this code of conduct and honor, that they would agree to fight fairly, that they would not they would accept the surrender of the other party, that they would even argue about who got to fire first on the battlefield and things like this. But it is defined as kind of a civilized or gentlemanly warfare, and this is very much the theory of warfare, that gentlemen will come out and they will order around their armies, and they will fight, and it will be conducted in a very fair and decent fashion. So here you can see many of the most important generals here for the British side, and William Howe will be the commander through most of the American Revolution, who's not honestly a bad general, nor was any of or most of these fellows, but nevertheless they just misunderstood how the objectives of the war here. But these are all aristocratic fellows, and how they conduct the war is based upon this very much this theory of social superiority. So we will come to see that in these various battles. And here are just a few of the key American generals here. And probably the best American general. I don't know how you really can define what it means to be the best or the greatest, but I would very much say that George Washington is the greatest general, because what other factor could be defined as being a great general other than winning the war that you were set out to win? Washington was not a great tactician, but he nevertheless was an enormously good judge of character that he saw in Nathaniel Greene, in Marquis de Lafayette, in Daniel Morgan. He saw great commanders, and he would send them into the South, and he would send them into the middle colonies. He would Alexander Hamilton. He would select these great personalities, these people who could do things that he himself could not. It was not the skilled tactician. And I think that this is a great mark of Washington's leadership, was that he was able to recognize his own personal weaknesses, and he was able to fill them by his excellent judge of character in order to bring in people like Nathaniel Greene, who goes down and beats Lord Cornwallis and Daniel Morgan in the South. But nevertheless, here we see, you have Benedict Arnold, the famous betrayer of the American army, who is probably the best general, and he and Horatio Gates just absolutely hated each other. But Arnold ultimately is a hero of one of the battles, the Battle of Ticonderoga, is where Benedict Arnold is the great hero of the battle. He's confined to quarters by Horatio Gates. And he finally he can't stand it anymore, because Gates is kind of this inept commander, and he comes out and he takes command of the army, and he wins the battle, and Gates wants him court-martialed, and Gates of course gets credit for the victory, and ultimately Benedict Arnold is swooned over by the British side on the promise of money. Because it's always said that his wife had such expensive tastes, and that he felt that, of course, that the American side was going to lose, and that he had to be on the right side of history. And history has, of course, judged him very harshly for this. The ultimate mark of a traitor is to be called a Benedict Arnold. And to return just a moment to the great Washington. And while he was not a great field commander, he was not a great tactician. He himself proved to be a masterful strategist. He learned quite quickly that he, with his militias, even with his Continental Army, with his regulars, that he could not defeat the British in open warfare, that they were too well provisioned, there was too many of them, and ultimately that their troops, there was more of them and they were better. So therefore he adopts this thing called a Fabian strategy, where he, instead of engaging the enemy, it's hit and run, hit and run, hit and run, hit and run. Never risk your army in an open battle. And it's a guerrilla tactics style warfare that you simply make the war so costly to fight that they are unable to continue the struggle because of you have made them spend so much of their resources in continuing to pursue you that they will eventually just give up. So the British strategy in this war was one that was predicated perhaps on that of European-style warfare, that they were going to kind of isolate the large city centers, that they were going to occupy the large cities, and that they would isolate the particular regions that they felt were extremely problematic, which was mainly the city of Boston and specifically the Puritan or New England colonies. And what the British wanted to do is, of course, play to their own advantage, which George Washington had foreseen, that they would fight pitched battles, and these would be decisive engagements where they would defeat the colonial armies, they would defeat the American armies, and that they would be able to eventually conquer the colonies, because there was such a massive amount of loyalists that they felt were in their midst, and that the loyalists would rise up, they would rise up in rebellion against the American patriots. And this, of course, would end the war very quickly, because the patriot factions of this struggle were ones that were not, there was just not that many in the British's mind. And that they felt once they had defeated the enemy in several decisive engagements, as they would, that this would put an end to the war and stop the resistance quite quickly. So for the first 3 years of the war, this was the strategy, and it just was not effective, because after a few battles, George Washington decides to adopt a guerrilla-style warfare. So then after 1778, there is a shift in the British strategy, because it was ineffective. It had proved ineffective. That they would simply hole up in large cities, and that they would go out into the countryside, and they would raid, and they would come back, and they would raid and come back, because they just simply didn't have enough troops and were not willing to bring in the hundreds of thousands of men that it would have required to hold the entirety of the colony. So they had to fight a limited war where they would remain in population centers, because they could defeat the colonial army on the battlefield time and time again. They had done that, and they felt that they just simply could not. They would get ambushed. They would fight in this guerrilla-style warfare against Washington, and it just was not effective, and it was not it was not cost effective. It was costing them so much money to have their armies so far away, and they had to go, and they were already in debt, keeping in mind that the position of the British was not strong, and they also had many international enemies. Then quite quickly, as the French come on, that Washington has to win a battle, and to get recognition that this revolution was going to be able to succeed, that then the French send over weapons. The French send over large amounts of money that will pay the colonial army. Let us not forget that the French were the first allies of the Americans against the British. But as the war drags on, that there's a new and changed strategy, and that the British really felt that the strongest area of their support, the colonial support, was going to be in the South. That as they faced entrenched resistance in the New England areas, that they could move their armies into the South. And under General Cornwallis, that they would secure control of this region, which was filled with the vast majority of the population they thought was loyalist. They would regroup, and then they would slowly move north and strangulate off the New England colonies, that they would divide and conquer. And it ultimately was not successful because of General Washington and his successful strategy of guerrilla warfare, as well as General Daniel Morgan, as well as General Nathaniel Greene in their brilliant tactical maneuvers, that they were able to defeat the British at Cowpens and Kings Mountain. That they would ultimately be able to to push Cornwallis toward Yorktown, which is the decisive defeat in the South. But it all begins at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And here the colonists had occupied the hills, the heights across Boston, and one of Washington's junior officers, Henry Knox, had went and secured some cannon, and they had placed them on Dorchester Heights, and the cannons precariously loomed over the city of Boston, and General Howe ordered his men up the hill to take these entrenched positions, and it did indeed drive the Americans back, or they drove them from their position, but they took enormously heavy losses, 800 casualties almost immediately in the battle. The British won, but this can certainly be considered a Pyrrhic victory, meaning that it cost so much for them to win this battle that it was almost, it could be considered a defeat, because they just marched straight up the hill. They took enormous pounding from the colonists, but they were able to win at Bunker Hill, but at great cost. And one of the most significant battles in the American Revolution was the Battle of Trenton. And George Washington, as I said, had to win a battle. And so why did he have to win a battle? It's because his troops were just about to be, their time that they had signed on to be his regulars in the colonial army had their tour of service was going to end, and he needed people to re-enlist in his army. He needed to boost the morale. He needed to win a great battle in order to convince the European powers to recognize the Americans, and to moreover give military and monetary support of these colonists over the mother power in Great Britain. So he makes a decision that he's going to risk everything. He's going to make a gamble. But Washington knew his enemy, and the Hessians, which these are Germans, mercenaries that were they were from a particular region of Germany that was related to George of Hanover, who is George III of England. One of his cousins, actually, of Hesse, brings over these. The King of England pays his cousin to use his soldiers. So they come over, and there's about 1,000, or there's approximately 5,000 Hessians that are fighting in the American Revolution on the side of the British. And in this camp, about 1,500 of them are getting ready to celebrate Christmas. And Washington knew his enemy. He knew how the Germans celebrated Christmas, that they celebrate Christmas on 2 days. That on the 23rd of December, that they enjoy a family get-together. And then on the 24th of December, they enjoy a celebration with friends, and they get dead drunk. And then it's Christmas Day the next day. So on Christmas Eve, Washington knew, because the Germans they didn't have their families there. It was just all a bunch of soldiers, that they would have been dead drunk 2 days in a row. And he puts his troops together, and they move across the Potomac River in the partially frozen Potomac River, and they make a daring raid on the city of Trenton. And Washington is nervous. He knows that he writes a letter to his brother that says, if something doesn't change, I think the struggle is just about up. So he knew he had to win. So he's got to risk everything. He's got to gamble here. This can't be any more guerrilla strategy. And so he risks his whole army here on one last daring raid on Christmas Eve. And they sail across in rowboats. They are ferried across the Potomac River, and they surprise the Hessians in the morning. They move through the night of Christmas Eve, and early in the morning at daybreak, cannons began to open up on the Hessian positions in Trenton. And the Colonel Rahl, he was so drunk that he gets up on his horse, or he calls for his horse because he thinks that there's fireworks, and he orders his men to strike up the band. And he is promptly shot dead off his horse by one of Washington's sharpshooters with their Kentucky or Pennsylvania rifles. And in this, there is a rout of the Hessians because they are absolutely unprepared. They are hungover or still drunk, and the Americans win an enormous victory here. Now, it's not a tactical victory here, but it is an enormous boost in colonial morale. In that they have beat a professional army, and Washington has won a great victory here against a very good army, though they were, all drunk in the middle of the night. But nevertheless, this is huge for the American Revolution. So in the North, there is going to be the capture of Fort Saratoga, and when John Burgoyne loses his entire army, when he is forced to surrender here to General Gates in the North, and this was the great battle where Benedict Arnold shows his prowess and was really the hero of the battle, although Gates gets the credit. But nevertheless, General Burgoyne's army is the entirety of his army, right? The strategy of the British is one will come from the north, one will come from the south. They will all meet in New England, and this shows the failure of the army here, where they had to surrender to a what was believed to be a vastly inferior colonial force. And this is and along with the Battle of Trenton, is where Benjamin Franklin, who is the diplomat to France, is here. He is able to convince the French to enter into the war on behalf of the colonists, to move into an alliance, to send weapons, because they are going to have to go into winter quarters here, and they're going to have to learn how to fight or they're going to have to learn how to beat the British in large open battles. So they will go into Valley Forge, where Washington, in his kind of darkest days, recounts his starving troops. So they're drilled by Baron von Steuben, who was purported to be a baron of the Prussians, as well as a general in Frederick the Great's army. He was neither of these things, but he was an excellent drill master, and he was able to help the American troops to learn how to fight in European style and fight well. But Benjamin Franklin, in this time, after this is over, the French are going to send money. They are going to send 10,000 muskets that are functional, unlike most of the the ones that had been provisioned by the Americans, because the Continental Congress, of course, has no money to send provisions or food until France comes to their aid and sends large amounts of funds to help defeat the British here. So Battle of Saratoga is huge in allowing Benjamin Franklin to get recognition. So now I want to turn to the Battle of Yorktown, which is the great loss of the British here. And General Cornwallis had been moving north, and finally he is pressed into the port city of Yorktown. And there he holds up, and he is surrounded by General Marquis de Lafayette, by Nathaniel Greene, and finally George Washington, who is able to show up with the entirety of the colonial army. They are able to besiege them. Now, the only problem with this is, yes, they have them by land, but Yorktown is, of course, right on the coast, and therefore the British fleet could easily have resupplied them, except for a massive and staggering defeat of the English Navy. The English Navy had not lost a battle on the high seas in centuries. They were defeated by the Dutch one time in the Thames estuary in right outside of London, but they had not lost in a pitched battle on the seas in a very, very long time. And Admiral de Grasse, the French admiral, of course, coming along with the money, the weaponry to be supplied with munitions. Also, they got the French fleet, which was a huge help in being able to stop the British and also make the war more costly. But Admiral de Grasse wins a magnificent victory here over the British, which was unheard of. And this strangulates Cornwallis to the point that he is forced, of course, to surrender to George Washington at Yorktown, along with 8,000 British troops who go over here. And they march out of their camp playing the song "The World Turned Upside Down," because they knew, and Cornwallis knew, and General Howe knew that the back of the British had been broken with the surrender of Cornwallis, that it was just simply too much. It was too costly. It would have required such a commitment to retake the North American colonies that they simply decide it is not worth the struggle. And so therefore Britain leaves and allows America to have its own self-rule, that there is a peace deal that is struck. And ultimately, let us just take a moment here and let us survey the consequences of this war on both the American Republic as well as Britain. America had indeed won its freedom, and in the coming lectures we will see how they will go about enshrining this in both a constitution and a means of government, and what this all will mean. But unquestionably, the Americans got self-rule, they got sovereignty. It recognized the genius of George Washington, that Washington as the kind of absolute moral authority and the great man will come to lead this new republic, and his effective strategy of simply a much more powerful enemy than his army could defeat. He employed this Fabian strategy, guerrilla-style warfare, and he was able to defeat a much superior enemy, as well as managing international diplomatic affairs and bringing the French in on the side of the Americans. Now, the enormous consequences that come out of this is that there is an economic depression that enters into the colonies, that it will take 30 to 40 years for the colonies to fully economically recover from the loss of British trade. This was economically devastating initially. And we'll see more on that with Alexander Hamilton and the creation of a national bank in order to have simply something as a currency. The money that was printed by the Continental Congress was just utterly worthless. Even the soldiers who fought in the American Army wanted to be paid in British pounds, because the paper that the colonial money was the dollars were just as worthless as the paper that they were printed on, maybe even less worthless. No one would accept them. So we see a staggering economic depression that enters into the colonies. Now, how does Britain react from this? Well, this forces Britain to get its house in order. It has a massive, massive debt that had come from the 7 Years' War, as well as fighting the American Revolution, and then continuing the struggle against France. So Britain will then develop a much more centralized and effective imperial policy, where it will be where London will be doing the administration, the governance, and it will change its model from one of focusing on its kind of less valuable colonies to one of focusing on what is going to ultimately make it the most profitable, and it will turn its eyes east instead of to the Caribbean to fight against Spain or France, but rather it will focus on its possessions that it got from the 7 Years' War, one of which was several of important cities in India. And this is much more lucrative trade than that of whatever is going on, some tobacco and timber and these kinds of things in North America. But rather, this will transition Britain's focus, and it will make it a far more effective imperial power, because it develops at this point an imperial policy of governance. that is different from than previously. It had not had a imperial plan until after the American Revolution, because at this point, if it wishes to continue being a first-rate power, it has to develop an effective imperial policy. So I would just like to leave this lecture on this thought, that if perhaps our forebears had simply agreed to pay a 1-cent tax on stamps and a very small tax on tea, that was the only taxes that you might be paying if you are an American. But nevertheless, they did not. So this is part of this great struggle for freedom, and that the American Republic has now been born, and in the coming lectures we will see how this all comes together, and how the American Republic comes to shape much of the history of the world after that, and why it is such an important and unique nation and eventually empire throughout the remainder of the 18th and then the 19th century. So thank you for watching.